right. So this chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, this is a good one. This is how can I, probably one of the most confusing passages in Paul, because, well, how can I put this? So there's a lot of debate on how to interpret this chapter. And really, there wasn't any debate until the last few hundred years. And the debate has to do with, Paul is trying to balance between some extremes that are happening in the ancient world in general. And I think we talked about this before. One issue that is coming up is the relationship between the soul and the body. So the Greco-Roman world is influenced by Platonism, not completely, but there's a large degree of influence of Platonism, which posits that the body is a prison for the soul. The material world is bad, the spiritual world is good. So this very kind of stark division. Now, the Jewish thought world is very different. The Jewish thought world really puts an emphasis on the human body. So you have two different, when you have this meeting of the Jewish world with the Greco-Roman world, you have some interesting combinations. And then a lot of the confusion has to do with how modern, generally Protestant interpreters, how they perceive Paul. And so basically what we go in, our preconceptions about Paul and about what he must have believed, kind of help us or inform the way we're going to read this chapter, because it is a little bit, it could be vague. And this, again, I've talked about the problem with all the letters of Paul. It's like listening to only one half of a phone call conversation. So we have to speculate what the question was that he's answering. And here we really don't know exactly. But personally, I think, I'll try to explain where the confusion is, etc. But the fact that this wasn't confusing to anyone, apparently, in the Christian world for like the first 1600 years or so, makes me think that more of the problem in understanding this has to do with us as modern Westerners, and we're so far removed from the thought world that it's hard for us to understand Paul's mind here. So, one thing I'll say is our upcoming Lenten retreat is going to be about thinking Orthodox, acquiring the Orthodox way of thinking, which is very different from kind of a modern Western rationalistic way of thinking. And, the Orthodox way of thinking is not legalistic. It can appear that way to some people, but it's really not legalistic. And in fact, I just wanted to tell you this story that someone told me recently, a bishop actually. So, and this is explaining the kind of the Orthodox way of thinking. So, imagine there are two men. Let's say there are two Greek men, maybe in their 50s, something like that. And they, like many Greek men, they smoke cigarettes, right? And so they go, the two decide to go to their spiritual father for confession. The one goes in first, and he says, Father, I have this bad habit of smoking, but can I pray still even when I'm smoking? And the spiritual father says, of course, you can always pray. Paul tells us to pray ceaselessly. You should be praying at all times, constantly throughout the day. And he says, oh, okay. The second guy goes in, and he asks the spiritual father, and he says, Father, when I'm praying, can I smoke? And the spiritual father says, what are you talking about? Of course not. No, you're praying. You don't smoke at that time. So the two go out and they talk to each other, and they say, oh, what did he tell you? And he told me I could smoke while I'm praying. And the other one says, oh, he told me I couldn't smoke while I'm praying. And so then they start discussing, oh, what does he mean? They're trying to, so this is where we kind of stand. We're at that last part where we're saying, well, he told him he could smoke. He told him he can't smoke. It's contradictory. So we've got to come up with some elaborate system to explain this rational discrepancy, right? But that is not the Orthodox way of thinking. The Orthodox way of thinking is depends on the question. The answer depends on the question. We have to be precise in what we're asking, right? Because really it's not a matter where we got this all sorted out in black and white and in categories, etc. It's really more the Orthodox mind. I would say it's more about priorities of principles, right? And I think this is something that I feel like as moderns, we really struggle with prioritizing things. So in other words, when you have several principles and then they come into conflict at some point in some particular case, right? Well, then you look at, well, which is the higher principle, right? What is more important? So we're going to see this throughout the Old Testament, throughout Orthodox tradition. You have to discern what the priorities are. So, and I'll give you another example here. So just recently, to give a recent example, maybe we can relate with some people, at this point in the pandemic, after 2 years, there's people have kind of hardened into their positions. It's become kind of ideological in some ways, et cetera. And then this will, enter into the church. The worldliness will enter into the church, and people will say, well, they're just all kinds of upset about having to wear masks, or other people not wearing masks, right? And they get themselves all worked up about this, and it's so wrong. And I can't believe the church is doing this. And there was a case recently where I said, well, that is a legitimate concern, what you're talking about. But the bigger concern is you. The bigger concern is you're not coming to church. The bigger concern is, you're committing adultery. The bigger concern is, but they want to focus on the masks, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that I'm committing adultery. What does that have to do with anything, right? I'm going to just focus and get obsessed with and get angry about the masks, right? Okay, no one's denying that that's an important issue. Obviously it's an important issue to you, but here's an idea. How about let's cut out the adultery first, right? Let's tackle the big problems first, right? Like not coming to church, okay, you're going to argue about what the church should do about this and what the Bible says and da. How about coming to church? Why don't we just try that to begin with before, you give a lecture to the rest of us on how to be Christian? So, it's about priorities. All right. So just having that in the background. And remember, I kind of hinted at the problems in this chapter last time, but remember, Paul is talking in chapter 5 when he introduces generally the problems in Corinth. In chapter 5, he gets down to specifics and he starts listing. It seems that he's responding to an actual letter from the Corinthians that was delivered to him by Chloe's people. So he's got some combination of a letter from the community, and he's probably in Ephesus, a letter from Corinth brought to him by Chloe's people, and he's got some combination of what the messengers are supplying him or telling him in addition to what's written in the letter. So he starts dealing with these issues. Chapter 5, there's this case where a man is sleeping with his stepmother, and they seem to be proud of it. For some reason, the Corinthians see no problem in this. No one chastises him. They even actually seem to be puffed up about it and proud of it. Why? Well, the traditional way of interpreting it is because in Corinth, you have Corinth was like the Las Vegas, the sin city of the ancient world. In particular, the sexual ethics in the whole Greco-Roman culture were very loose and different from ours, but particularly in Corinth. So the background that people usually assume for Corinth is that you have this place of kind of sexual promiscuity, right? And then we see this in chapter 5 of this man who's sleeping with his stepmother. And it seems, and this is where the interpretation comes in, that they're all puffed up about it and proud of it because in their mind, he was showing that he's already living in this kind of freedom, quote unquote, that Christ has given him, that they're already living this kind of resurrection life. And so therefore, the body is really not important. And so these things they do with their body, Paul quotes in the last chapter, is lawful for me to do all things, but not all things are beneficial, right? So he's trying to correct this understanding they have about what is really freedom, what's true freedom. So most people have assumed the background here is the sexual immorality of Christians. The problem comes in now that in modern times, just in the last couple of 100 years, people have become, I would say, particularly Protestant theologians, because it's more and more and more unusual in the Protestant world to have any kind of monasticism, right? So that's kind of been left behind in the tradition. So then when that happens, it's much harder to understand these kind of passages that put any kind of value whatsoever at chastity, purity, virginity, right? So then you start looking, well, Paul must have meant something else. Paul can't disagree with me, right? This is what I think. So Paul always agrees with me. So therefore we must have misinterpreted something. So then they posit that what was really happening was that you had a bunch of ascetics, like super ascetics in Corinth, who were denying all kinds of sexuality, right? That they had totally eschewed any sexuality and all of them wanted to remain virgin and chaste. So that's rather than the opposite, which is what was normally assumed, is that you had this problem with sexual immorality, according to Paul. Now they're not sexual enough. Apparently, this is the new interpretation of Paul, and so that's how they want to read the text. This will make sense as we go through it. All right. So, any questions before we start? All right. So, verse 1, chapter 7, verse 1. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote to me. All right, so again, this seems to be like a formula where he's going down and he's going to keep repeating this. I think 5 times in 1 Corinthians, he repeats this formula. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, which was pretty standard. So in other words, all right, let's take up point 1. You asked about this. Here's my answer. And even here, we have already the interpretive problems begin. So he says, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So it's very clear that this phrase, not to touch a woman, means sexually, right? So it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So it could be, some people take this as Paul simply stating this fact, right? That this is his opinion. It is a good thing if a man chooses to be chaste and celibate, and not enter into relations. Or other people say, no, Paul's actually quoting a slogan from the Corinthians, like he probably did with all things are lawful for me, but that was their slogan probably, all things are lawful for me. And then he adds, but not all things are beneficial. So some people argue, well, he's bringing up some of these slogans of the Corinthians, perhaps that they wrote in the letter, and he's quoting him and then kind of nuancing them. So some say that this is Paul's opinion. Some say this is a slogan he's quoting of the Corinthians, which may not necessarily be his opinion. And some say it's a question. It could be read as a question too. Is it good for a man not to touch a woman? So, in other words, in this interpretation, we're imagining that they've written in this letter to Paul a series of questions that they have about the faith that they want him to answer. And they're simply asking, is it good for a man not to touch a woman? Now, I think traditionally, probably the interpretation would be that they're asking this because they're somehow confused. They're somehow getting 2 different messages. And remember, when Paul's writing to the Corinthians, after he's left, these other teachers have come in and are teaching something else. And the identity of these teachers is also a mystery. So the real problem is we don't know what's going on in Corinth, and we don't know what the original letter said. So because some people, especially modern Protestant interpreters, are saying that these new teachers have come in and told them, have imposed on them this ascetic ideal, and that Paul is pushing back on that. Then some people, the more traditional interpretation is that the pressures of the Greco-Roman society and the cultural norms for sexual morality of the world are pushing against what Paul taught them, and they want some clarification. So at this point, it's not clear. So he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, or is it good for a man not to touch a woman? In any case, ultimately, really, I think from the Orthodox perspective, a lot of this so-called conflict of interpretation has really been way overdone. there's really not a conflict here if we read it in a sober way with the fathers. I think the main reason it's become controversial is because some of the things he says are extremely inconvenient for some people, so they want to get around them. All right, so he says, okay, is it good for a man not to touch a woman, or it is good for a man not to touch a woman? Nevertheless, so this makes you think that it probably, wasn't a question, but more of a statement, either on his part or the Corinthians. He says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, and really it's plural, because of sexual immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. All right, so again, still we're not sure where he's going with this. Okay, verse 3. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. So, and then here we have, a translation issue. Here it says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband, or the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Here it says affection. I mean, I think against the Jewish backdrop, against the purely Jewish backdrop, in Jewish marriages, there was actually a marriage contract written, and it actually stipulated that there was this mutual obligation, that it was one of the obligations of the husband to have relations with his wife, because thereby they would produce children. All right. So it definitely does seem to mean this, these marital rights, conjugal rights, etc. And the Greco-Roman culture would have definitely agreed, like we talked about last time, for them, their idea about sex was totally different than what we have inherited as a result of our Christian heritage, whether we realize it or not. So for the Romans, sex was this kind of bodily function that was, just like going to the bathroom or blowing your nose or whatever it may be. It was something that was necessary. It was kind of considered, you didn't really have control over it. And that men had all the rights, right? So men could use for sexually anyone who was in a lower social position to them, and no one questioned this. Even their own wives. The wives really had a status in the ancient world of almost like property sometimes, and so even the idea of rape is totally different in the Greco-Roman world. Rape in the Greco-Roman world really didn't have to do with consent. I mean, in their view, the wife didn't have the option to consent or not to consent, right? This didn't exist. The rape for them was when a man went outside the bounds of who he could use sexually. So in other words, anyone lower than him socially, he could use as he wished. He could exploit them. They had no say in it. Consent was irrelevant. But if he attempted to use, let's say, the wife of an equal, a social equal, or to sleep with the wife of the emperor or something like this, that would be considered rape, even if she consented, because it's not his property, right? So this is the Greco-Roman view of sex. In the Jewish view, there's I would say, it's similar, but there's considered a mutual obligation. All right, so the wife, so each woman should have her own husband, each husband should have his own wife, and that they should render the conjugal rights, they should render each to the other. So the Greco-Roman culture, some of these Corinthians are very influenced by Greco-Roman culture, or they're not Jewish by birth. And so for them, okay, yes, the husband has conjugal rights. Of course, we accept this. But for Paul to keep adding the mutuality, right? In all these cases, he says he starts with the one thing that they could agree with, and then he adds the other, which they say, whoa. So he says, the husband has rights over his wife. Sure, of course. And the wife has rights over her husband. Oh, what's he talking about? So he's trying to nuance their understanding. And again, it's against this backdrop in the ancient world of extreme asceticism and extreme libertine attitude. So in other words, either a complete, since the body in the material world is basically worthless and negative, it doesn't matter what we do with it, right? It just matters what your spirit is, right? On the other hand, you have this extreme asceticism, which is trying to live here and now, kind of above the demands of this negative body, of this evil material body that we have. So these are the two extremes, and we're not totally sure what the background here is, what the Corinthians are struggling with exactly, but the much more likely argument and traditional argument is that they're coming from a place of sexual looseness and immorality. All right, so 5. All right, say, okay, 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Okay, they all agree with that, right? And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. What did he just say? 5, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. All right, so that's how they translate it here. There are some differences here. Let's see. So here he says, here the translation is stop depriving one another. All right, so this kind of assumes that it's already happening, that what's happening in the community is that these people with this ascetic ideal are imposing it on their spouses, other members of the community, and that he has to curb this and encourage them to have more sex. So according to this interpretation, this kind of more modern one, so they translate it, stop depriving one another, assuming that it's already happening, except by agreement for a time. So the concession that he's talking about in this case, so for the modern Protestant interpretation, the concession is, okay, I'll allow you to fast sometimes, but then you got to get right back to sex. The other kind of more traditional understanding is the flip, is that the concession is because of your lack of self-control, because of the burning passions, which he keeps referring to in the rest of the verses here, that he says, okay, you know, you can by mutual consent, you can for a period abstain so that you can focus on prayer, and then some manuscripts add prayer and fasting. But then he urges them come together again to avoid temptation. All right, so we're going to see as this unfolds, it'll hopefully become clear what he's really meaning to say. 7. There we go. 7. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. So what does this mean? Again, now lately in the last couple 100 years, there's a question about this. So basically, I would say the last 200-300 years in the Protestant world, there was, especially in the 1800s, out of the German school of Lutheran theologians, there was this big push that in this debate between the Hellenistic influence, the Greek influence on Paul, and the Jewish influence on Paul. And they come to say that all this Greek influence, all this Hellenistic influence was a later addition of the church, which, you know, usually means something negative for them. And that really we got to strip all of that away to get back to the original Paul, who was purely Jewish, right? He was just so thoroughly Jewish that he couldn't imagine any of this Hellenistic stuff, these Hellenistic ideas about the extreme asceticism or the extreme opposite of this libertine attitude, and that he's firmly grounded in this Jewish tradition. They also argue, though, that he, you know, had no use for the law. So he's extremely Jewish, but he has no use for the law. I mean, it's kind of a strange biography that they're trying to write of Paul. This Paul that they're reconstructing looks a lot like what they believe in 19th century Germany. But the fact is that that Paul was probably this distinction, this really rigid distinction between the Jewish world and the Hellenistic Greco-Roman world is probably a false dichotomy, that already, even before Paul, for a few hundred years, there was this blending of the Jewish and Hellenistic world, and that Paul is a product of that. That's the more traditional picture of Paul. But so this comes up here in 1 Corinthians 7:7, because he says, "For I wish that all men were even as myself." This has always been interpreted as that he is celibate, right? Well, now recently, some people say, well, that's just impossible, because the Jews didn't really value celibacy, and rabbis, even rabbis were married. And so, but they can't get around the fact that Paul does say later that he's single. So they say, well, he was a widower then. He had been married. Where they get this, I don't know. It could be true, but there's absolutely no evidence for it one way or another. But this is what they say. So in other words, again, to kind of keep Paul from being read as against marriage. That's really what, when monasticism drops completely out of the Christian picture with the Protestant world, then they have no way of explaining these ideals of celibacy, etc., because the only option for you is marriage, right? So then they become very concerned that Paul not seem to be denigrating marriage in any way, which he's not. But they're reading all of their own kind of concerns back into Paul. All right, so he says plainly, "I wish that all men were even as myself," meaning not married. And he makes this clear in a few verses. But he says, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. And this is going to be a theme that he repeats in chapter 12 in particular, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, the love chapter, right? The love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13 is always cut out in the Western world and inserted into marriage ceremonies. But really, Paul, and his hymn to love, he's not talking about marriage at all in 1 Corinthians 13. He's talking about the love that binds Christians together, each being a different member of the body of Christ, one an eye, one a hand, one a foot, etc. And that love is what binds all these parts of the body together so that they work in unison as one body. And this is because there are this variety of gifts, charismas, that God has given to each person, so that they're all called to the same purpose, but they play different functions or roles or parts of this body of Christ. So he's saying, I wish personally, my own opinion is that it would be better if everyone was not married like me. Why? Because he's going to say in a few verses, because then you can fully devote yourself to the Lord. Nevertheless, he says, but each one has his own gift from God. This is a matter of gifting, right? How were you called? What gift did God give you? What role in the body of Christ did he assign you? It's not that one is better than another. It's simply, are you being what you were called to be? I don't know. I just thought of the other day, my little Dami, she asked me about our dog, Apollo. And, she was kind of struggling with this idea of, are humans better than dogs? Can we say that, right? I think she really didn't like this idea of, feeling superiority so that people could abuse or exploit animals, right? Just because they're perceived as inferior. And so she said, are humans really so much better than dogs? And I said, well, Apollo, our dog, he is perfect at being what he was called to be, right? He was made by God as a dog, and his telos, his purpose, his goal to which he's moving is to be a dog, right? And so he's doing that perfectly. And I said, we've been called to be humans. And so we're going to try to do that perfectly in accordance with God's will, to grow into the fullness of the stature of Christ, right? That's our telos. That's our goal toward which we're moving, to be a true human being as Christ showed us how to be. So in that sense, we're equal. Not one is not better than the other. We're doing what we were called by God to do, what we were made by God to do. Okay, so the same thing is what Paul is saying here. And we're going to see later that this is a big problem in Corinth, these spiritual gifts, that they're exalting some spiritual gifts, like the ability to speak in tongues, etc. They're exalting some spiritual gifts as better than others. And Paul's saying, no. So it's not a question of which is better. celibacy, virginity, or marriage. That's not the question. That's kind of how our modern mind wants to frame the question, but that's not the question that's being asked here. Paul's simply saying, do what you are called to do. And in that way, you'll be perfect, right? If you are called to be married in the Lord, do that and do it well. Do it as a Christian. If you are called to be celibate, do that well and do it as a Christian, right? So we don't force someone to do something that they're not given the corresponding gift to do. So, we see this, there's already from the early centuries in the church, a difference between East and West on this understanding. In the West, they're shaped a lot by Augustine's views of sexuality, which frankly, are probably wrong. He's affected by his own context, his own history, but it really seems to kind of prioritize, let's say, the celibacy of the priesthood, right? There's enforced celibacy of the priesthood in the Western tradition. Whereas in our Orthodox tradition, as we all know, the priests can choose to be married, but they have to decide before they're ordained, and then they're to remain in that state, right? So it's a matter of indifference. If you are gifted to be a celibate, do that. Stay that way. If you are gifted to be married, stay that way. And we can say that to be married is a gift. It's not, I think probably there are some people who don't have the gift of being married, and it's reflected in the fact that they're not able to stay married for a long time. We see this in people. Why? Perhaps because God has not given them that gift to be married. He called them perhaps to another gift, but society has not maybe given them a choice to pursue other arrangements, such as being celibate. I mean, in Greece, it's commonly accepted that to become a monk or a nun is a perfectly legitimate choice in your life. In the Western kind of Protestant world, it's absolutely inconceivable. Only a crazy person would do that. So that means socially being celibate's not really an option in this kind of way dedicated to the Lord. All right. So 8, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows. All right. So now part of the confusion too is, who is he talking to? So here he helps us. He makes it perfectly clear who he's talking to. He's saying, I'm talking to the unmarried and to the widows. And it doesn't necessarily mean those who have never been married, because in Corinth, at this time, Greco-Roman world, divorce was very common. Very common. And then in the Greco-Roman world, unlike the Jewish world, in the Greco-Roman world, women had the right to divorce. In the Jewish world, only the man could divorce the woman, but the woman actually had the right to divorce. Divorce was, like with sex in general, with marriage, these were kind of practical concerns for the Romans rather than any kind of spiritual or religious concerns. So it would have been common for, I say, to the unmarried and to the widows. So, and of course, it was also common for people in general to die much younger in those times, and especially men because of war, etc. So there were more widows. And when he says here the unmarried, probably he's referring to people who were married at some point and lost or got divorced. So basically, both of these cases, the unmarried and the widows, are people who were formerly married, who society would expect to remarry now. So that's a different pressure, right? So he's saying specifically to these people who were previously married and now find themselves not married for one reason or another. He says, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. In other words, again, if they remain celibate, it is good. Like he says at the beginning, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But, so that's good. And he's not saying good and the other's bad. He's saying this is good and this can be good too. So it's not an either or proposition. But he says, if they cannot exercise self-control, and this is a word that, we still use in the Orthodox Church, ingratia, which is, an ancient Greek concept, meaning this self-control. And it was something that was valued by some of the Greek philosophical schools, like the more kind of out there ones, like the Stoics and the Cynics. They valued this self-control. So he says, to those who are divorced and to those who are widows, it's good if you remain as you are, celibate, not married. But if you cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. All right. And here it says burn with passion, and all these, you see it in italics here, which means that it's not actually in the text, that they're supplying it. It literally just says to burn, but the common use of that word is pretty indisputable, that it means with some kind of eros or lust, an erotic kind of desire. So it's probably okay to add to burn with passion, because there was one interpreter who wanted to argue that it means to burn in hell, and that's almost certainly not correct. He's saying it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So it sounds like maybe what we would call a concession. He's not saying it's bad, but he's saying if that's the case, then obviously, if you're burning with passion, then obviously this hasn't been given as a gift to you. So don't try to do something for which you've not been gifted. All right, 10. Now to the married, okay, so now he turns to those who have been divorced or widowed. I say this, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So the rabbis were always careful to do this, and Paul's always careful to do this as well, to separate when he's giving his opinion and when he's giving a command. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. And this word depart is kind of the standard term meaning divorce, leave, abandon. 11, but even if she does depart, so even if she does divorce him, let her remain unmarried. So just like in the previous case, he said to those who are divorcees or widows, it's better to remain as you are. So here again, he kind of repeats himself. He says, so I say, if you're a wife, don't depart from your husband. But if you do, if she does, let her remain unmarried, just like I said before, or be reconciled to her husband, the original husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, all right, so he had talked about the divorcees, the widows, the married, and now he says, but to the rest. So who is he referring to? He's referring to those who have never been married, probably. All right, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. So again, this mutuality, which, especially for the Jewish world, would have been very uncommon. And when he says believing, he means believing in Jesus Christ. 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. All right, so this gets a little confusing. So let's see. So he's saying he's giving his opinion here to these different categories of married, unmarried people, but eventually he is going to quote the Lord's saying, which is recorded in all four Gospels, I believe, his teaching on divorce. I think we'll get to that in a second. All right, so he says, so what's he saying here about the wife can sanctify the Christian wife can sanctify the unbelieving, non-Christian husband, and the Christian husband can sanctify the non-believing non-wife. All right, so what he's saying here is it's against the background of the Jewish world. So what made someone a Jew, right? What made someone a Jew in the ancient world? So really, the Jews entered into a covenant with God, and this covenant was really between, well, I wouldn't say that, but the covenant is manifested physically in a way that you can point to tangibly through men, right? So you were a member, you were a real Jew if you were a circumcised Jewish male. If you're a female, the way that you belong to the covenant, to this covenanted people of God, is through a male, a Jewish male. So as a daughter, you belong to the covenant, you're sanctified, made holy, the holy people of God, through your father, who is a Jewish male, circumcised Jewish male. Or once that daughter leaves the Jewish male, or maybe they're non-Jewish and they marry a Jewish male, they are enter into the Jewish covenant through the husband. So a woman is Jewish either through her father, who's a circumcised Jew, or her husband, who's a circumcised Jew. So what he's saying here is, so for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. All right. So what he's doing here is he's twisting things in a way they can accept, that especially the Jews or those familiar with Judaism understand, okay, it's the man. And even in the pagan Greco-Roman world, it was expected religiously that if a pagan man married a woman who was a foreign woman who didn't share the same gods, whatever it was, she was expected to conform to his gods, right? She was expected to leave her practice, religious practice, and conform to his gods. But what Paul's saying here is that unlike in Judaism, when the woman has to be sanctified by a male, has to be incorporated into this holy people of God to the male, Paul's saying that actually in Christianity, it cuts both ways. He's saying it cuts, and this is the radical thing that he's saying. So he's saying in baptism, so the way that you're a Christian is that you're baptized. And if you are a baptized Christian woman, your husband, who's not Christian, can become sanctified, can become potentially a member of the holy people of God through you, so that the man, through the woman, through his spouse, can become a member of the covenanted people, which is not possible in Judaism. Does that make sense? So it's a radical thing that he's saying, that there's this mutuality. He's saying that whatever your sex or gender, male or female, you can incorporate your non-Christian spouse into the Christian people of God through through enduring with them, through staying married to them. So then he says, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. Now, in this whole section here, a lot of people speculate that Paul is talking about a specific case, that either they related to him as part of the letter or that Chloe's people kind of elaborated on. It seems that he has in mind a particular case where there's a Christian woman in Corinth who is trying to divorce her husband who is pagan. And it seems that he's telling her, don't do that, because you can save him. This is what your priorities should be. You can be a blessing to him. And also, he reminds this woman, otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. Because in the Greco-Roman world, if in the case of divorce, which was common, as we said, the children belong to the husband, right? In our society, it's the other way around. Usually the children, if there's a divorce, the judge tends to side with the mother, but in the ancient world, no way. It would side with the father. The children would go to the father. And so he's saying to this Christian woman, if you divorce him, you're going to lose, not only you lose the possibility of converting him, you're also going to lose your children, because they're going to go with a non-Christian father and be raised in paganism. And he's saying, that's not good. So none of these outcomes are good for you, he's saying. You should be thinking about the salvation of others, your husband and your children.
Father Gregory,
yeah.
Can I ask, when did this tradition change in the Jewish tradition, that nowadays the Jews, if the mother is Jewish, the children are Jewish? Not when, and that is now any child born of a Jewish woman is automatically considered a Jewish child and has the right to be a citizen in Israel. And so that is completely the opposite of the original concept, where the father had to be a circumcised Jew, or the husband, And so I just wanted to, at this point, since we're discussing this question, I thought I'd bring that up and see what your point of view is.
So, we know that the shift happens, and it seems that the shift happens definitely after Christ. So in the time of Christ, it would still have been patrilineal through the father. But, I've talked about this before, that really a lot of times we don't really understand Jewish history, right, apart from Christianity. Really after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you have Jesus, you have his death and resurrection, the birth of the Christian movement. Shortly thereafter, you have the destruction of the temple, which still to this day has not been reconstructed. So there's a radical shift in Judaism. after the destruction of the temple. And it starts to kind of develop in parallel and in contrast to Christianity. So really, most scholars, even Jewish scholars, view Christianity and modern Judaism, which is really comes out of the Pharisees. Modern Judaism is this extension of the Pharisees. It's really the only group that survived, let's say, after the destruction of the temple, because they were already prepared. They didn't need a temple already. Their worship was based in synagogues, etc. So they were poised to be successful in a Judaism without a temple. So you have them birthed kind of simultaneously as twins coming out of this common mother of Second Temple Judaism, right? That's the way most scholars look at it now. So really, we kind of have to think of modern Judaism as something new, and actually even Jewish scholars consider it to say that it may actually be younger than Christianity. So these twins, it's the younger twin with Christianity. So anyway, so part of the shift that happens with modern Judaism born after 70 AD is that they switch from patrilineal to matrilineal. And there's all kinds of speculation about why this might have been, but the most obvious one is that especially if you're living in an occupied land, you're not living in your own kind of autonomous kingdom where you get to make your own rules, you get to secure your borders and keep people in or keep people out, that you have much more mixed marriages, right? And so, just practically speaking, it's a lot easier to prove that a child came from a particular woman than it is to prove that the child came from a particular man, right? Especially in a time before DNA. So it became a more kind of secure way of assuring the purity, let's say, of the Jewish people. But for Paul, I don't think he would be thinking in these terms. Some people argue that already there was kind of a shift happening in Paul's time, but anyway, I don't know if that clears up too much. All right, so all right, yeah, and then here, in some cases, again, we have this different reading. You could take what Paul says one way or another, depending on your kind of assumptions. So he ends here, okay, but the children are now holy. Verse 15. But if the unbeliever departs, if the unbelieving husband divorces the wife, let him depart. He says this to Christian women. So it seems he's talking about one Christian woman's case in particular, where she actively wants to divorce her pagan husband. He tells her, don't do that. You have to think about his salvation and your children's salvation. But he says, now, if the pagan husband, if he wants to divorce you, the Christian wife, then you do no wrong. You can let him depart, let him divorce you. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. So what does that mean? It means, this is kind of a technical term, meaning that you are free to read, right? So, and this was a big question throughout the Old Testament and the time of Moses. This is a big question in Jesus's time. Jesus is asked about marriage, but it's a little bit harder for us to understand the context. So, and first of all, in Judaism, the ideal is monogamy, but there was polygamy in ancient Judaism. And then actually even in modern Judaism, up until the 10th century AD, there was polygamy. Not in Christianity. From the very beginning, this was completely unthinkable for Christianity. And this was always the ideal of Judaism, although by concession, they would allow polygamy. So when it says a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, it's talking about, how did the Jewish system from the time of Moses deal with divorce? Because even though divorce was clearly not the ideal, Moses the law provided a way for there to be a divorce. A husband had to provide a writ of divorce. He had to put in writing, and a Jewish court would approve it, that there was a divorce, and then they would issue a letter for each person. And if it was a legal divorce, then they could issue a letter to the wife saying that you are not bound. You are no longer bound by marriage, and therefore you are free to remarry, right? So when he's basically saying, if you as a Christian initiate the divorce, then you fall under the Lord saying that one who does that commits adultery and forces the spouse to commit adultery. But if, on the other hand, your unbelieving non-Christian spouse divorces you, then in that case, you don't sin and you're free to remarry. And then, of course, it would apply to what he said earlier. It would be better for you to stay as you are, but if you do get remarried, you don't sin, but you should get married in the Lord, meaning to marry a Christian and not be unequally yoked. All right. So he's saying, if the pagan divorces you, you're not under bondage and you are free in that case to remarry if you so desire, or to stay celibate as I recommend. But God has called us to peace. In other words, again, he uses this word called, talking about vocation. What is it that God created you for, right? And he's saying, first of all, God has called us to peace. So let's keep that priority, right? Instead of debating and wringing our hands over whether other people are wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, why don't you just concern yourself with what you're called to do? And the big priority that God wants us to have peace. So it's definitely not God's will to go on and on and on about masks or no masks, or in this case, about marriage or not marriage, to cause problems, to argue with other people, sow disunity and discord. That's not what God's calling you for. Yes, he has rules and laws and commandments concerning this thing, but if you're going to get it all twisted up and make such a big deal out of it, you're losing sight of the higher purpose, which is that God called us ultimately for peace. So don't be going to the courts and making war, trying to divorce your pagan husband. For how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, a husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, here they've read it in two ways. Traditionally, it's been read as, you may save your husband. You should be concerned about these things, that you can actually evangelize and save your spouse through your faithfulness, right? But some want to interpret it now as, well, how do you know whether you're going to save your husband? So, I mean, it's not a sure thing. So, whatever you want to do is fine. This is an unlikely reading, in my opinion. But because then he goes on to say, 17, but as God has distributed to each one, has assigned to each one, and this is the word that he uses for the distribution or assignment of gifts, that God distributes gifts, and necessarily they are different. If I have a whole bunch of different gifts, or parts of the body, eyes, hands, feet, etc., one will be this, one will be this, one will be this. They're equal but different. So again, he's reiterating, as God has given you a gift, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. So in the case of the dog, let the dog be a dog. That's what he's supposed to do. Don't tell him to be a human. He's supposed to be a dog. The same with humans. Treat him as a human. He's not a dog. He's called to be a human. So let each one recognize what gift they've been given by God, first of all, and not insist on their own will, and do what you've been called to do. And then he says, and so I ordain or direct in all the churches. And so I direct in all the churches. So in other words, this is one of his principles that he reiterates in every church. 18, was anyone called while circumcised? Again, going back to this idea of how you are called. God calls each person. Was anyone called while circumcised? Meaning, did you become a Christian having already become a Jew, or having already been born a Jew? Let him not become uncircumcised. And actually, yeah, the translations here aren't so good. Let him not become uncircumcised. Let him not, yeah. Really, the word there is a kind of technical word, which means there was a procedure, actually, a medical procedure that they would do in antiquity to kind of reverse the circumcision. So they were able to cut a flap of skin and then pull the skin so that it hid the fact that they were originally circumcised. Now, why would they go to all this trouble? Well, this was apparently a big issue. And again, this whole idea that the German Protestants have, that this conflict or whatever between Hellenism and Judaism occurs in Christianity, and that the Christians kind of don't have any backbone and let Hellenism take over. I mean, it's all nonsense. I mean, this kind of encounter between Judaism and Hellenism started occurring 300 from Alexander the Great, 300 years before Christ. So already in these centuries, 300 years before Christ, we have all these recorded cases of Jews who are growing up in the Greek world, so like Alexandria, Egypt, in particular, where there may have been more Jews there than in all of Judea, that they're influenced by Hellenism, and that many of these Jews had this procedure to remove the marks of circumcision because it was embarrassing. Especially for men, they would go to the gymnasium, right? The gymnasium was where everyone went to exercise, for public baths, a kind of also networking. And there everyone would exercise in the nude. And so for socially conscious Jews growing up in a Hellenistic world, there would be a lot of incentive for them to seek this procedure that would hide their circumcision. So because it was looked down upon, it was considered a mutilation. So he's saying, and the Christians in Corinth, again, we're not sure exactly what their identity is and what the different influences are, but it seems to be some mix. There are some Jews, there are some Gentiles, there are some slaves, there are some free people, there are some men, there are some women. So it's hard to generalize and what the whole Corinthian church was saying. Paul's dealing with different shades here, but for those, he's saying, if you're a Jew, don't go and have this procedure to hide your circumcision or Jewishness. And conversely, was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. So again, this Orthodox phronema, right? Let's keep in mind what the priorities are. You guys are getting all excited, and we know that this was a big problem. It was the reason they had to call the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. This whole question of whether new Christians had to be circumcised was a huge and divisive issue. And Paul again is repeating, forget this. Don't get worked up about these minor issues, right? Because it's not about circumcision or uncircumcision. Both are fine. The key is keep the commandments. Do what God has called you to do, right? So then you can extrapolate, why is he bringing this up now in the context of marriage versus celibacy? Because he's saying the same thing. He said marriage is nothing and not marriage is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God, fulfilling the calling which God has given you. That's what's important. Keep your eyes on the prize, he's saying. Don't get distracted by these issues which seem to the world to be really important, but here I'm kind of adding, are really the devil. They're really the devil trying to distract you with these minor, unimportant issues and let you lose sight of the big picture, which is do what God called you to do. Don't worry about what God called someone else to do. If God called someone else to be the eye and he called you to be the hand, just concentrate on being the hand. That's it. Don't worry about the eye. Do your job, as Bill Belichick would say. All right.
Father,
Yeah.
let's get to the circumcision issue before we move on to the next move.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is here in America now, almost every male child is circumcised at the hospital. Mostly. Now, people, let's say in the Middle East who are Christians, do not circumcise their children.
Same in Greece.
But to go back to the origin of the circumcision, which was the covenant agreement between Abraham and God, and which was carried through into the actual Judaism as well as Islam. Now, the Muslims circumcise, and it's a big feast of circumcision because they are still following the Abrahamic covenant,
Right.
and agreement. But then again, let's look at the scripture where he says, let's say in the Old Testament, the saying when he says, woe to you who are circumcised yet uncircumcised, meaning the circumcision of the heart.
Yeah.
And that the circumcision that is a physical circumcision was supposed to be an indication of believing in God, and God is the one who circumcises our hearts. So there's a deeper story about circumcision, is what I'm saying. Although Paul is discussing the actual physical circumcision versus the non-doing it. And really what he is basically coming down to the point that whether you're circumcised and are circumcised, since the Gentiles now though that have become Christians are not necessarily have to be circumcised, but he is really actually pointing to the fact that the origin of circumcision was that the heart is circumcised by God, that it has to do with your faith rather than your physical behavior. Is it, am I on the right track?
Yeah. I mean, I don't see any difference. I mean, to me, he's saying the same thing here. He's saying don't worry about the physical circumcision, and then later he can add in a different context. What's really important is the spiritual circumcision. But I might quibble with you a little bit about the role of personal individual faith. Yes, that plays a role, but more so, I mean, the biblical, I would say the biblical view, Paul's view, is more what they would call cultic, or maybe what we would call sacramental, rather than individual belief, right? So, I mean, this idea of kind of this emphasis, exclusive emphasis on individual belief is really a result of Protestantism in the modern West. But for which, once they stripped all the sacraments or most of the sacraments out, then, doesn't no longer makes any sense. Well, what is this kind of cultic or sacramental belonging? So for us, yes, the individual faith definitely plays a part. You have to have faith in order, in combination with baptism. But really, I think what Paul's talking about is how are we sacramentally united to the promises of the Old Testament? And there he would say that it's through Abraham's faith. So not through my faith, it's through Abraham's faith. And then that is passed down to us through his seed, right? Which is Christ. And yes. So Christ is our faith. Christ is our justification. Then this gets into the whole question in Galatians when it says, we are, it talks about, being justified through the faith of Christ, right? So that's usually, so literally the translation, literally the Greek says through the faith of Christ, through Christ's faith. But it's usually translated as through faith in Christ, which, not necessarily wrong, but many people have argued now quite convincingly, in my view, that really, Paul's talking about both things. He's talking about our faith in Christ, but he's talking about Christ's faith, his fidelity and faithfulness to the will of the Father, and that it's through Christ's faithfulness that we are justified and incorporated into the promise given to Abraham through our faith and his faithfulness, if that makes sense. So anyway, I would just underline the fact that it's not purely an individual belief issue, but that it also has a sacramental quality, that Christ does these things for us and we unite ourselves with him. He's the seed of Abraham. All right, so let's see. All right, we'll wrap up here. All right, so he's saying, keep your eyes on the prize here, that following God and keeping his commandments, and specifically that which was appointed or given to you as a spiritual gift, do that. If God called you to be celibate, or if God called you to be married, focus on being an excellent Christian wife, or an excellent Christian husband, or an excellent Christian nun, or whatever it is. Be a Christian at what it is you're doing. Don't get so concerned in what it is. I think I talked about that in the sermon about God's will. God does not care if I'm a baker or a banker, right? The question is, am I a Christian baker? Or am I a Christian banker, right? Whatever it is I've been called to do, am I doing it in a Christian way? Now, of course, some things, like I was saying, I'm going to be a drug dealer or arms smuggler or something. These, probably not God's will, and we should avoid those. But otherwise, it really doesn't matter that much, but focus on what's important. Stop wringing your hands about whether God wants you to study law or medicine, and focus on being a good Christian student, a good Christian lawyer, or a good Christian doctor. So don't get distracted by these minor issues. And I would just say again, this whole mask issue, like, don't get distracted. This is this is called an attack from the right. An attack from the right in the Orthodox tradition, meaning sometimes there's the normal way the devil attacks, from the left. We're used to him coming at us with these evil ideas, right? And then we say, oh, of course, that's evil. I'm not going to do that. But sometimes he attacks us from the right, meaning he suggests to us something that technically, legalistically is correct and right, but he makes it demonic by giving it way too much power and influence and turning us into, making us angry and passionate about these things when, yeah, it's important one way or another, but it's not that important, so that we are not being Christian in the way that we're doing supposedly what God wants. All right. So then he's saying, so he says in verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. And okay, we'll stop there, but he does go on to kind of elaborate this. Now he's going to talk about slave versus free. And so, it's interesting. If we look at Galatians 3:28, there's this baptismal formula he cites. There's neither slave nor free. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither male nor female. These were the three main social categories. And actually, let me just conclude by reading you this great quote. So in the Mishnah, which is the Jewish, it's kind of a, what's the word? Definitive Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament for modern Judaism, rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism. So Rabbi Judah, a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who was a big rabbi in the 2nd century, he says, blessed are thou, he's talking to God, blessed are thou who has not made me a heathen, Gentile, Greek. Blessed are thou who has not made me a woman. Blessed are thou who has not made me a slave. Right? So this is how the rabbis in the 2nd century perhaps thanked God for not making them a slave, a Gentile pagan, or a woman, right? Because these were all three considered inferior. And to be a Jew, to be a member of the covenant people, it was first and foremost a male privilege. Now, Paul, so then people say it cannot be coincidence that Paul, in his baptismal formula, specifically says there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female. He's specifically conscientiously rejecting this Jewish belief that there were these important distinctions. He's saying no, and he's proven that throughout this chapter. He's saying if you are baptized a Christian, whether you're a man or a woman, your spouse, your unbelieving spouse, can enter into the covenant through you. And you don't have to be a free person. You don't have to be a male, and you don't have to be Jewish, right? And so he's going to elaborate on that in the next few verses. All right. As we finish up, anybody have any questions? Anything really confusing? So let's see. Let me just go back and clarify this part here. Back in 7:10. Yeah, so here he started. I kind of skipped over this. Before he says, it's not the Lord's command, but my opinion, he starts with the Lord's command. Now to the married, oh, wait a sec. No, he doesn't. I thought somewhere in here he made a distinction. Maybe it was earlier in the chapter. And so now he's saying that, I'm not saying I'm the Lord. Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was, so this whole idea of abstaining from marital relations. So, in the Jewish background, in a purely Jewish background without any kind of supposedly Greek influence, that would be unusual. I mean, there wasn't too much value in celibacy. It was very, very valued that you remain chaste, meaning that that you not commit adultery, etc. But celibacy was, a little bit unusual. And so actually the Pharisees at the time of Paul, and Paul, remember, was a Pharisee, there was actually a debate about how long a married couple or how long specifically a man, because it was all on his purview, all on his choice, how long a man could abstain from sexual relations with his wife. One school said that it was 1 week, and one school said up to 2 weeks. So this is kind of the background. And then also that's that same debate, which was a really live debate in Jesus's time about divorce. Remember they asked Jesus, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? And the context, we misread it sometimes, is the debate was, are there limits on the reasons I can give for divorcing my wife? And because there was one school that said, no, there's only certain things like adultery is a cause for divorce. There's another school that said anything can be a cause for divorce. If your wife burns your food, you can divorce her. But then that gets a little more complicated, because that was actually the liberal school who said you could divorce your wife for any reason. Why would they say that? Because they were trying to protect the women. Because if you could only be divorced because of adultery, if there was a divorced woman, everyone knew she committed adultery. But if you could divorce them for any reason, including burning your food, then she had a chance to get remarried, because her name wasn't necessarily sullied, right? And remember, they were always getting, it was very common to remarry. All right, so any questions? We'll pick up at 7:21 next time.